This is Dr. Mike, and I wanted to add just a little bit of perspective to this week's studies as we study the Roman Empire. I've made a big point, I think, through most of our discussions thus far to distinguish for you between the Roman Republic, which was the first almost 500 years of Roman history, and the Roman Empire. With the death of Julius Caesar, things did shift fairly rapidly into a dictatorship, and the power of the Senate, of course, diminished, and it was kept more as a figurehead kind of an organization. I think I've mentioned to you also that I enjoy movies, especially historical movies, and probably my all-time favorite movie is the movie Gladiator, which you may have seen. I watched that movie for two things. Number one, I like the opening scene because you get a great idea of what the Roman Empire was in the way of technology, with all of their weaponry and things as they were fighting there against what were the Germanic tribes in the north. But you also, there's an interesting scene with Marcus Aurelius, who is the Caesar who is dying in that movie, and he doesn't want his son, who he considers to be weak and a politician, to take the throne, and he offers it to his general, whom, of course, the son ends up killing his father. I'm not sure how historical that accurate that is, but anyway, Marcus Aurelius does die, and the son takes the throne of Rome. And Marcus Aurelius makes some great statements. He said, I want you to return Rome to what it was, back to the days of the Republic. And of course, that did not happen. And so for the next 500 years, Rome is going to suffer from good and bad emperors, and it's going to suffer, great advances and great losses. The one you are probably most aware of is Augustus Caesar, who was Octavius, who was Julius Caesar's nephew, and who took the dictatorship of Rome from the time of his uncle's death. And as I've said before, and I say this again because I want you to kind of get this in your thinking, so much of what we know in common knowledge as human beings about Julius Caesar, we did not learn it from the history books. We learned it from William Shakespeare, which is really interesting. There are a lot of things in history that have taken on a life of their own outside of history, and that's one of them. Another interesting thing, and I'll mention this in passing, are the things about Columbus's voyage to the New World. You were probably taught in fourth grade, if you're like most of us, that the fears of Columbus's sailors were they'd sail off the end of the world, or they'd be killed by sea monsters or whatever. Most of that was not true in 1492. In 1492, they knew already that the world was round and that you would sail around the world and not off the edge of the world. That misinformation came from a children's book that Washington Irving wrote in the late 1800s, in which he talked about those crazy things. Somehow that got into the psyche of teachers, and no matter how hard we try, there's always still someone who's teaching that bit of fabrication to their children, and we grow up with that in our toolkit of history knowledge. So you always have to be very careful of where you're getting your knowledge from. But at any rate, a lot of what we know, we would call back scenes from Shakespeare's play, and of course the Et tu, Brute and the Ides of March and all those things were a part of his fabrication of a play. Whether they happened or did not happen, we're not sure. But at any rate, that's what's in our consciousness. The Roman Empire, as I've said before, was great with technology. They literally are going to prepare roads across the Roman Empire and make it safe to travel by water and by road, and get rid of, highway robbers and all those things. And I think I've mentioned this in passing as well, that was very definitely in the plan of God, because we talked about the Greeks contributing Greek language and then spreading it to the ends of the known world. And so for these centuries since Alexander, Greek has become the coin of the realm, much like English is today in the world of commerce, in the world of education and teaching. Greek was that in that day. So basically, when the New Testament was written, it was written in Greek, and then shortly thereafter, the Old Testament got translated in the Septuagint in Greek as well. So we had a Bible in the language of the majority of the people. And the Romans' contribution was that it was safe now for the men to carry the gospel to the ends of the earth from the book of Acts, from the day of Pentecost, when there were people in that crowd out of every nation under heaven, the Bible says, and they each heard Peter preach. They heard it in their own language. That was the biblical gift of tongues. Everybody heard it in their own language. There is no such thing as an unknown tongue. If you look at that word in the King James Bible, it's in italics, which means it was put in to clarify the point. It didn't do much to clarify it. It actually confused the thing. But at any rate, they were able to carry it to the ends of the earth because of the Roman roads. Roman cities had tremendous technology. I was in Jerusha in Jordan in 1980 to look at the ruins of this Roman city. They had hot and cold running water in their house. They had a sewer system with stone manhole covers. They had great luxuries and things that they enjoyed. And when Rome fell in 476, it was a major setback for the civilized world. In fact, we go into the Dark Ages from 476 to about 1200, and we'll talk about that shortly. But Rome was at the very height of its power. And of course, they extended the empire to the ends as far as they could reach. All the way into England. They built Hadrian's Wall to keep out the Vandals and the Jutes and the other uncivilized barbarians. Notice those terms. To the north, they had to deal with the Huns and the Visigoths and the Germanic tribes, which would one day be Germany. And so they began to stretch themselves very thin. They had to, for years, the Roman army was only made up of Roman citizens who understood what Rome was, how important the ideas of Rome were, including Republican ideas that we hold dearly to. As they go on and conquer more and more people, they need more and more soldiers. And so they take the step of allowing these non-Roman soldiers into the army who have no allegiance but to the generals and who have no allegiance but to being paid or being bribed or whatever. And so they followed the generals. This is going to set Rome up for a disaster toward the end because they fought. It's like, well, Julius Caesar, he's a prime example of that. He had been in Gaul, which is now France, fighting for with the legions. And when he came back to Rome to force himself upon the Roman people as one of the two consulars, he brought his army with him and left them on the other side of the Rubicon. You will recognize that term probably from a phrase that we often use, talking about crossing the Rubicon. When his army crossed the Rubicon to come up against Rome, that was the last straw. And of course, Caesar became a consular and then, of course, the only ruler before he was killed. And so basically Rome starts down this road. Augustus, who I mentioned, will be the Caesar during most of the New Testament. If you remember in the early parts of Matthew and Mark and Luke, when we're talking about the nativity, it says in the days of Caesar Augustus, there was a taxing made that everybody had to go to their own city and be registered. They counted the people and they levied a tax against them, which brought Mary and Joseph to Bethlehem, to the place the Bible would foretell would be the birthplace of the Jewish Messiah. So basically, Rome is working into the plan of God, the history of God, and so was Augustus Caesar. Augustus Caesar he did rule over the longest period of Roman peace that there was, the Pax Romana. And so basically they finally had captured and pushed back most of the enemies. And of course, when he died, there were lesser men. We know Caligula and we know Nero, who fiddled supposedly while Rome burned. These people, some of them were not mentally agile enough to hold these offices. Some of them had some mental problems, as did Caligula and Nero. Others were power hungry. And so we have all kinds. We have a Freudian mix of people that are going to hold the position of Caesar. 325, Constantine is the Roman emperor, and he is warring with in the far off reaches. And he has a dream one night, and the dream, he sees a cross in the sky, and there is a voice that says, "In this sign you will conquer." So he basically asked what that cross meant, and somebody said that is the sign of the Christian. And so Constantine adopted Christianity. You have to realize now the use of words here is very important, because as you study the life of Constantine, you realize he didn't become a Christian per se. He adopted Christianity as one of his pantheon of other gods, one among many. His mother, Queen Helena, would go to the Holy Land, and she would build churches on top of most of the sites today that we venerate in the New Testament as biblical sites and Old Testament. But that was important. It was not a bad thing, because had she not done so, they probably would have disappeared. So you would have had nothing to go and visit. But so Christianity becomes some type, a part, persecution stopped. You know that Christians were being persecuted in the 1st to the 3rd centuries. Persecutions would stop. But it is not until 391 that Theodosius, the Roman emperor then, makes Christianity the religion of the Roman Empire. And when he does that, then all other gods will stop. And there's something very interesting happens, in that the church will change its holidays to match old Roman paganism, so that we can get the pagans to come to church. They're not going to come to a Christian church, but yet if we take October 31st, which is All Hallows Eve in the church, it was All Saints Day, we can combine those two into a religious holiday. Or we can set December the 25th as Christmas, and that was a holiday to a Roman god of the sun. And so they made that the birthday of Jesus. Jesus was not born on December the 25th, because you don't have shepherds in the fields in the Holy Land in December. Much more likely it was sometime in the spring. The Easter holiday is probably the most valid one, because it's tied to the Jewish ritual of Passover. And so, this is how the church began to take into it pagan ideas. And of course, by the 5th century, becomes the Roman Catholic Church. So basically there are a lot of pagan ideas within that religious system. The mother and child icons that you see were an old Babylonian idea. The spire on the church steeple, which even Baptist churches have retained, were a pagan idea. So a lot of paganism crept into Christianity. So be very careful when you talk about Christianity. What kind of Christianity are you talking about? Most of us read our views back onto the past and assume, and you always get in trouble when you assume, that they were the same as our own. You and I are, thousands of years, hundreds of years away from those days. And our religion that we practice in Christianity probably still has some of the elements of paganism. The Puritans brought pagan elements in their religion, in this idea of witchcraft and the Salem witch trials. That was an old pagan idea. It was certainly not Christian. And so there is some intermixing sometimes with religions, and there is no such thing as a pure religion. So from 300 till the Reformation in the 1500s, there was little else in the world but the Catholic Church. And the only Bible in that world was one in Latin. It was Jerome's Bible. So, we don't get an partial English translation. We get one from Wycliffe in about the 1300s, just a partial translation. There is no English language before 1050, 1100. So when I grew up, I used to hear Baptist preachers say, well, I read the Bible that Paul read, the King James Bible. No, you didn't. There was no English language. There was no King James Bible until 1610. So basically, you got to get those kind of thinkings in your mind to realize the perspective that you're talking about. So Rome falls in 476 and is taken over by these northern Germanic tribes. And literacy stops within 200 years. Nobody's reading. And it's not until 800 when Charlemagne, the Frankish king, is crowned Pope of the Holy or King of the Holy Roman Empire by the Pope, that he begins to force priests back to reading again. But religion is, very different. It is mainly the Catholic Church, and attempts have been made to study groups that were outside. There were a very few outside the Catholic Church that were persecuted, but religion as we know it, as New Testament Christianity, was certainly at a low ebb from 476 in the fall of Rome to the 1500s. Now, the church did move after Rome fell to North Africa, and there's a whole history there of the North African church and the popes, and we can talk about that a bit later. But there's a great deal of history here that you need to think about. I hope some of this has kind of spurred your thinking, make you read more, make you go and study more. But this week, as we talk about the Roman Empire, think about some of the things that I've mentioned to you. If you have questions, please address those to me, and I will get back to you as quickly as possible. Thank you, and have a great week.